I wasn't searching for buried machines when I first opened the cadastral maps of 19th century Berlin. The inquiry began with routine urban planning documents, yellowed sheets folded into municipal ledgers, the kind of material that usually confirms what every textbook already claims to know: street grids aligned, foundations traced, sewer routes marked in confident ink. Nothing dramatic, nothing mysterious. Then I noticed the spaces between those lines, entire blocks where the foundations were thicker than required, corridors beneath government districts that did not align with any recorded utility project, subterranean chambers drawn in a different hand, with annotations that stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, as though whoever wrote them had decided not to continue. In later editions, those chambers were gone, not crossed out, not explained, simply absent. When I compared the earliest versions to renovation records from the 1890s, the discrepancy widened. Reinforced vaults beneath ministries that predated the structures above them, brickwork described as existing long before permits were issued to build anything in that location, measurements that exceeded what standard civil engineering manuals of the era recommended, as if the builders had been planning for loads no official blueprint acknowledged. Walking those districts today, it is impossible to see any of this from street level. Stone facades, ties where they always have, tram lines hum, government offices function as they have for generations. And yet beneath that ordinary rhythm sits something heavier, older, and stubbornly undocumented. The city itself becomes difficult to ignore at this point, not as a backdrop, but as a layered artifact. Streets laid over sealed corridors, new foundations anchored into masonry, whose origin no file explains. When questions appear in the margins of records, they are followed by silence in later volumes. It is an unsettling place to begin an investigation, not with a discovery announced to the public, but with a pattern quietly removed from view. The deeper I traced those omissions, the more they suggested that what lay under Berlin had not been forgotten accidentally. It had been replaced. The next layer of the inquiry lived not underground, but in paper. Municipal archives from the 1890s are usually models of order: survey sheets stacked by district, engineering drafts annotated in careful block lettering, renovation permits stamped, filed, and cross-referenced. In theory, they form a clean narrative of how a city modernizes itself. Berlin's did not. When I placed the earliest foundation plans beside later redevelopment schematics, the lines refused to cooperate. Conduits appeared where none had been approved. Vaulted chambers were labeled existing in documents that otherwise treated the surrounding structures as new construction. Load-bearing walls were drawn at thicknesses that made little sense for sewer systems or storage corridors, then quietly reduced in later revisions without any record of demolition. The margins were where the tension concentrated. Short notes from surveyors, written in hurried script, questioned elevations that conflicted with street level. Engineers flagged materials that did not match procurement logs. A single memo referred to prior masonry of unknown origin. Before the phrase disappeared entirely in subsequent drafts, names remained, observations did not. Every time the record approached an explanation, it veered away. What replaced those irregularities was not a rebuffal, but a smoothing. Lines straightened, terminology shifted, routes were reclassified as routine utilities. In later maps, the problematic features were absorbed into the city's official story, stripped of whatever had made them stand out in the first place. The pattern mirrored what the foundations had already suggested. Something substantial had been there first, and instead of being documented in full, it had been drawn over, reframed, and folded into a newer narrative that asked no questions at all. Curiosity no longer felt sufficient to describe what the documents were doing. Suspicion began to take its place. The documents only told part of the story. To understand what had actually been drawn over, I had to follow the trail forward in time, into renovation reports written decades after those first suspicious blueprints were filed away, late 19th, and early 20th century construction logs described crews breaking through foundations they had not expected to find. Brickwork denser than surrounding structures. Arched ceilings buried beneath administrative buildings. Long corridors sealed behind masonry walls and labeled simply as obsolete voids. The language was practical, almost bored, yet the measurements were anything but ordinary. The conduits ran parallel to streets that had not existed when the surrounding stonework was laid. Ceramic-lined channels wide enough for a person to walk through disappeared beneath districts that official records claimed had never housed major utilities. In several cases, inspectors noted metallic elements embedded in the walls, alloys they did not attempt to identify, only to remove or reroute around. Photographic evidence surfaced occasionally, stapled into reports, or preserved in separate folders. Grainy images showed men standing beside circular shafts whose interiors vanished into darkness, or kneeling next to junction chambers crowded with pipes that did not match known water or gas systems of the period. Faces were blurred. Labels were missing. In later compilations, those same pages were replaced with typed summaries, and no images at all. What unsettled me most was how often the same features reappeared across districts that shared no official infrastructure projects, similar vault dimensions, identical conduit spacing, brickwork patterns that repeated beneath ministries, transit hubs, and industrial quarters alike. The mismatched blueprints had hinted at something overwritten. The renovations suggested something far larger, a network that no longer wanted to be named. By the time the individual sites were plotted together, the pattern refused to remain local. Corridors uncovered beneath one district, aligned with sealed passages beneath another. Junction chambers discovered under administrative buildings mirrored those beneath industrial quarters kilometers away. When I overlaid renovation maps from different decades, the lines connected into something that no municipal project ever acknowledged: a continuous subterranean system threading beneath the capital itself. It was not random. The routes curved deliberately around ministries, followed the perimeter of rail terminals, dipped beneath former exhibition halls and early electrical stations. Wherever the surface city had concentrated authority or industry, the buried network appeared to have arrived first. Institutional fingerprints surfaced only obliquely, committee minutes that discussed subsurface irregularities without diagrams, budget reallocations for redevelopment projects that never specified what was being removed. A brief exchange in a planning ledger paused on the phrase "existing structural impediment" before trailing off into blank space. Nothing named, nothing denied. The more comprehensive the layout became, the harder it was to accept as a collection of forgotten basements. Someone had planned this, someone had coordinated it, and later someone had decided the public record would not remember that coordination at all. What troubled me most was not the scale of the buried routes, but how neatly the official narrative curved around them, as though the city's visible history had been drafted to avoid acknowledging what lay beneath its streets. By this stage, the physical network beneath Berlin no longer felt like the central mystery. The paper trail was becoming harder to ignore. Ledgers from the same municipal departments that had documented foundation work with obsessive precision suddenly thinned out around the sections that corresponded to the buried routes. Page numbers jumped. Project names shifted mid-series. Entire volumes referenced annexes that no longer existed in the archive boxes that supposedly held them. Terminology changed in subtle ways. Where early reports spoke of subterranean structures, later ones softened the language to legacy voids. Vaults became irregular cavities. Conduits were reduced to obsolete channels. The engineering specifics that once filled paragraphs were compressed into single lines, then removed altogether in subsequent revisions. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like censorship. Just a steady, bureaucratic sanding down of detail until only the safest version of events remained. Occasionally, dissent surfaced at the margins. A handwritten note from a city historian questioned why redevelopment files contained no demolition permits for the masonry they claimed to replace. Another annotation queried the absence of photographs referenced in a technical appendix. Both comments were circled in red pencil in later reviews, followed by stamps indicating the matter had been closed, without resolution. What unsettled me most was how neatly the documentary disappearances aligned with the physical ones. Where tunnels had been sealed, descriptions vanished. Where chambers were filled in, diagrams dissolved into simplified schematics. The city was not only burying infrastructure, it was rewriting its memory of having done so. By now, curiosity had drained away. What remained was the growing sense that silence itself had become part of the system. By now, the absence in the records felt less like coincidence and more like a boundary. I stopped looking for names and began tracing functions instead. The conduits beneath Berlin did not resemble drainage. Their diameters were inconsistent with sewage loads, their linings too smooth, too uniformly sealed. Ceramic composites appeared in stretches that predated the cataloging of such materials in municipal procurement logs. In several sections, the walls were threaded with copper lattices, arranged in repeating geometric intervals, not decorative, not structural in any conventional sense. Routing patterns complicated matters further. The tunnels did not simply follow streets. They crossed beneath them at angles that ignored later property lines, converging beneath civic buildings, rail hubs, and former exhibition halls. In a few cases, clusters of shafts terminated beneath sites that had never housed heavy industry, places better known for administration than manufacture. Reports from later inspections used a vocabulary that felt imported. Load distribution, field saturation, transmission loss. The phrases appeared without explanation, embedded in maintenance documents that otherwise concerned humidity levels and subsidence risks. Whoever wrote them assumed the reader already understood what sort of system lay below. That assumption, repeated across decades, became difficult to dismiss. I found myself pausing over one line, underlined in fading ink. Residual conduction detected. Detected from what source? Another file referenced legacy channels still capable of intermittent response. No apparatus was described. No experiment attached. Only the quiet implication that something beneath the pavement continued to behave as if it had once served an active purpose. It would have been easier if the evidence pointed in a single direction. Instead, each technical fragment added weight without clarity. Drainage could not explain the latticework. Ventilation did not account for insulation layers designed to prevent heat loss. Communication networks made little sense of the mass and scale. Energy distribution sat at the edge of plausibility, not as a declaration, as a pressure building behind the documents. The specialists who authored those reports never stated what they believed the system had done. They did not need to. Their language carried the residue of a conclusion already reached, one that no longer appeared in public summaries. I began to recognize the pattern. Physical structures without explanation, records without origins, technical language without context, and beneath it all, the steady suggestion that Berlin had once been threaded with a network whose purpose had been carefully softened. The question no longer felt abstract. It felt procedural. If this was a power system, then it had been designed to serve something. And whatever that something was, the city had learned to stop talking about it. 1892 refused to behave like an ordinary year. Once I isolated it on the timeline, the surrounding documents began to rearrange themselves. District names shifted between editions of municipal directories. Streets that had existed for decades acquired new designations without explanation. Redevelopment programs appeared simultaneously in multiple boroughs, framed as modernization initiatives, yet tied to parcels of land that had not previously been considered unstable or obsolete. The coordination stood out. Orders were issued within weeks of one another, stamped by different offices. carrying identical language about subsurface standardization and harmonization of legacy structures. The phrasing felt imported, as if copied from a template circulating above the public layer of city planning. No engineering rationales accompanied the directives. No feasibility studies were attached, only signatures. Sometimes the names repeated, sometimes they vanished after that year. I followed the seals instead, wax impressions embossed with departmental crests that no longer existed, filing numbers that led nowhere in later registries. A note in one planning ledger referenced an urgent topographical revision whose map insert had been removed, leaving behind only the glue shadow along the binding. Removed when? And by whom? Political actors surfaced only through their handwriting, initials on requisition slips, authorizations routed through special committees whose minutes had not survived. The effect was oddly impersonal, decisions of enormous spatial consequence reduced to ink strokes and margins. By now, the network beneath the streets and the paperwork above them had begun to move in lockstep. Structures sealed, routes reclassified, neighborhoods renamed. The calendar refused to treat it as coincidence. 1892 did not announce itself as a turning point. It behaved like one that had already been decided somewhere else. The maps changed first. The silence followed. By the time the strands were laid side by side, they no longer behaved like separate inquiries. The buried conduits, the softened terminology, the synchronized revisions of 1892, each had once seemed defensible in isolation. Cities evolve, records decay, districts rename themselves, but when aligned, the changes produced a different shape altogether, one defined less by development than by substitution. Something had been removed, and something else had taken its place. The physical alterations were the easiest to track. Masonry sealed behind newer brickwork, junctions rerouted into dead ends, shafts capped and catalogued as geological irregularities rather than engineered passages. What disturbed me was how precisely those interventions matched the archival edits. Where a chamber disappeared from later surveys, its blueprint was truncated. Where conduits were reclassified, the language in procurement logs shifted to accommodate the downgrade. The city's underground had been simplified in matter. Its memory had been simplified in ink. I kept returning to the same uneasy observation. None of the records announced destruction. They described improvement, modernization, rationalization. The vocabulary of progress masked a quieter operation. An older layer of explanation was being overwritten, not erased outright, but compressed into something harmless, something administratively dull. Enough remained to justify the new plans, not enough to reconstruct what had come before. At one point I caught myself whispering the question aloud. What exactly had required this much coordination? No answer followed, only the expanding circumference of the pattern. Committees without minutes, maps without inserts, engineers whose technical language lingered long after the systems they described were supposedly obsolete. The city had not lost its infrastructure in some dramatic catastrophe. It had misfiled it, gradually, methodically, across decades. The implication pressed inward. If Berlin's buried network had once served a purpose significant enough to restructure districts, mobilize political signatures, and alter archival language, then its disappearance was not merely architectural. It was historical, the kind that leaves a hollow where an explanation should reside. What unsettled me most was how ordinary the process appeared. No declarations, no scandals, no visible rupture, just the patient replacement of one story with another. And beneath that replacement, something older continued to sit in the dark, mapped poorly, labeled cautiously, functioning just enough to leave behind traces that refused to align with the official account. I had begun this investigation looking for anomalies in stone and brick. I was now confronting anomalies in narrative itself, and the more carefully the past seemed to have been rewritten, the harder it became to avoid the final, destabilizing thought. If a system of this scale could vanish without acknowledgement, then its absence was not an accident of time. It was a decision. Walking through Berlin now, it becomes difficult to separate what is visible from what has been deliberately folded out of sight. Modern transit tunnels trace paths that predate them. Utility corridors widen unexpectedly, then narrow again, for no apparent engineering reason. Platforms curve where straight alignments would have been cheaper. Load-bearing pylons descend into strata that city surveys insist contain nothing of note. The explanations offered are always practical: soil instability, earlier construction phases, abandoned prototypes. Taken individually, they satisfy. Taken together, they begin to feel rehearsed. I found myself following subway schematics the way I'd once followed 19th century cadastral maps, laying translucent layers atop one another, watching alignments recur across generations of infrastructure that officially had nothing to do with each other. The same intersections surfaced, the same subterranean depths were avoided or quietly reinforced. In several stations, renovation documents referenced pre-existing voids whose origins were never specified, only accommodated. Maintenance reports echoed the phrasing legacy chambers, structural inheritances, inherited brutes. The words had survived even when their reference had not. What unsettled me was how seamlessly the buried system had been absorbed into the functioning city. Not dismantled, not studied publicly, used, redirected, stabilized, treated as an inconvenient but dependable substrate. Beneath newer ambitions, the network had not vanished. It had become background. At some point, the investigation stopped feeling archival and began to feel immediate. The past was no longer sealed in boxes or footnotes. It was carrying trains, venting air, channeling cables beneath crowds who had no reason to wonder what older geometry supported their routines. I noticed my own language shifting as I took notes, from discrepancies to substitutions, from revisions to inheritance. The city had not erased its previous form. It had learned to live on top of it. That realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, in the way one notices a pattern too late to remember when it first appeared. And beneath the daily movement of Berlin, beneath ticket barriers and escalators and polished signage, the older system continued to outline itself in absence, not as ruins, as foundations. What disturbed me most was how effectively that continuity had been normalized. If concealment had once been an emergency response, it had matured into routine, and routine sustained long enough becomes indistinguishable from history. By the time I reached the end of Berlin's records, the investigation no longer felt geographically contained. What had begun as a local anomaly had acquired the proportions of a template. I started searching for similar phrasing in infrastructure archives outside Germany. The language repeated itself with unsettling fidelity. Legacy corridors, uncatalogued substructures, pre-existing conduits of unknown origin. Cities separated by borders and centuries were documenting the same absences using the same vocabulary of accommodation. It was not proof. It was something less comfortable. Pattern. In Vienna, tunnel reinforcements were logged decades before the lines they supposedly supported. In Prague, electrical retrofits referenced chambers that did not appear on any public survey. In Paris, flood control renovations intersected with vaulted systems whose construction dates were perpetually postponed by footnotes and revisions. The same shape emerged: discovery, reclassification, integration, silence. I caught myself hesitating before writing the last word. Silence suggested intent. The records preferred neutral terms: oversight, reassessment, administrative consolidation. Yet the effect was identical. Structures older than their surroundings were absorbed into municipal life without public explanation, stripped of narrative, while remaining operational. I asked a simple question in my notes, one I had avoided framing directly until then. Who benefits from an inheritance no one remembers receiving? The documents did not answer. They deflected, margins filled with references to defunct committees, signatures belonged to offices that no longer existed, jurisdiction migrated from department to department until responsibility dissolved into rock procedural haze. The system did not disappear, it diffused. What unsettled me most was not the scale of what had been buried. It was how easily it had been normalized across continents. If something vast enough to reshape cities could be rewritten into background infrastructure, then the act itself was not exceptional. It was practiced, refined, exported. Berlin no longer felt like a singular case. It felt like an example, and examples imply a rule. I closed the final folder without resolution, only a growing awareness that the investigation had outrun its origin point. Whatever had been concealed beneath 19th century streets did not remain there. Its traces surfaced wherever modern systems layered themselves over something older, heavier, and unclaimed. The absence was not random, it was organized, and that realization refused to settle into anything resembling closure. It stayed with me, unresolved, pressing against every subsequent map, every blueprint, every renovation notice that assumed the ground beneath our cities was neutral. Because once you notice the pattern, you stop asking what lies buried. You start asking what has been quietly allowed to remain in use.